You're sitting in a castle, and you look out over the walls. What you see makes your blood run cold. The horizon is black with enemy soldiers, 80,000 of them, maybe more. They have cannons that can reduce stone walls to rubble. They have elite troops who've never known defeat. They have the full might of the most powerful empire on earth. And you have 2,000 men. Most of them aren't even professional soldiers. You're outnumbered 40 to 1. Any sane person would surrender. Any reasonable commander would negotiate. But surrender isn't an option, because if this castle falls, an entire kingdom falls with it. This is the story of one of history's most impossible military victories, a battle so unlikely that even today historians struggle to explain how it happened. This is the story of the siege that shocked an empire and changed the course of European history forever. The year is 1521, and the world is changing fast. In the east, there's a new sultan on the Ottoman throne. His name is Suleiman, and he's young, ambitious, and he's got something to prove. His father, Selim I, had been a warrior sultan who expanded the empire massively, conquering Egypt, Syria, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Suleiman has inherited the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen, and now he needs to show that he's worthy of his father's legacy. And when an Ottoman sultan wants to prove himself, he goes west. He goes toward Europe. Now, here's the thing about the Ottoman Empire at this moment in history. It's not just powerful, it's terrifyingly efficient. Their army isn't a feudal rabble like most European forces. It's professional, well-organized, and technologically advanced. They have the Janissaries, elite infantry troops taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be the perfect soldiers. They're disciplined, they're loyal, and they're absolutely deadly. The Ottomans also have something most European armies don't have in the same quantity or quality: artillery. Massive bronze cannons that can fire stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. In an era when warfare is still dominated by castles and fortifications, the Ottomans have perfected the art of knocking those fortifications down. Suleiman looks at the map of Europe and he sees opportunity. The Holy Roman Empire is distracted by internal religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation is tearing Christianity apart from within. Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door just 4 years earlier, and now Catholics and Protestants are at each other's throats. It's the perfect time to strike, and the perfect target is the Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary sits right on the border of Ottoman territory. It's wealthy, it's strategically important, and it's been a thorn in the Ottoman side for decades. The Hungarians have actually been pretty successful at resisting Ottoman expansion. They've won battles, they've held their borders, and they've been a major obstacle to Ottoman ambitions in Central Europe. But there's a problem. The Hungarian king, Louis II, is young. He's only 15 years old when Suleiman becomes sultan. He's inexperienced, and worse, his kingdom is divided. The Hungarian nobility are constantly fighting amongst themselves, more interested in their own power than in the national defense. It's a recipe for disaster, and Suleiman knows it. In the spring of 1521, Suleiman makes his move. He assembles a massive army, somewhere between 70 and 100,000 men. Nobody knows the exact number, but everyone agrees it's enormous. He marches north, crossing into Hungarian territory. His target is the fortress of Belgrade, one of the keys to Hungary's southern defense. If Belgrade falls, the road to Hungary's heartland is wide open. The Ottomans besiege Belgrade, and despite a brave defense, the city falls in August. It's a catastrophic loss for Hungary, but it's just the beginning. The next year, 1522, Suleiman continues his campaign. His armies push deeper into Hungarian territory. They capture fortress after fortress. The Hungarian defenses are crumbling. And this is where our story really begins, because there's one fortress that becomes the focal point of Ottoman attention. It's not the biggest castle in Hungary. It's not even particularly famous. But it occupies a position of tremendous strategic importance. Its name is Koszeg, though history will remember it by a different name. The fortress of Székesfehérvár. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because the fortress I'm talking about isn't either of those. It's a small castle in western Hungary, near the border with Austria. Its name is Koszeg. Now, you might be wondering why Suleiman would care about this little castle. Here's why. Suleiman isn't just trying to conquer Hungary anymore. His ambitions have grown. He wants to strike at the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire. He wants to threaten Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburg domains, one of the great cities of Europe. But to get to Vienna, his army needs to march through western Hungary, and Koszeg sits right on that route. It's a small fortress, yes, but it guards a critical pass through the hills. If the Ottomans want to move their massive army and their heavy siege guns toward Vienna, they need to control this route, and that means they need to take Koszeg. The problem for the defenders of Koszeg is that nobody thought the Ottomans would come here. Hungary's main armies are elsewhere, trying to defend the more obvious targets. Koszeg has been left with a skeleton garrison. When scouts bring news that an enormous Ottoman army is approaching, the commander of the fortress, a Croatian nobleman named Nikola Jurisic, takes stock of his situation, and it's grim. He has maybe 2,000 defenders, some sources say fewer, YB 1,400, maybe as few as 800 soldiers plus local militia. The sources vary wildly, but let's be generous and say 2,000. Many of these aren't professional soldiers, they're townspeople, merchants, craftsmen, who've been pressed into service because there's nobody else. They have some cannons, but not many, and not the enormous siege guns that the Ottomans possess. Jurisic looks at his force, looks at his walls, and knows exactly what's coming, because the Ottoman army that's marching toward him isn't some raiding party. It's not a detachment. It's the main Ottoman army, commanded by Suleiman himself. The sources disagree on the exact numbers, but most historians estimate somewhere between 80 and 120,000 troops. Let's split the difference and say 80,000, because even that number is almost incomprehensible. 80,000 professional soldiers, supported by hundreds of artillery pieces, with supply trains stretching for miles, all bearing down on a tiny fortress defended by 2,000 men. Any rational military calculation says this isn't even going to be a fight. It's going to be a massacre. The Ottomans will surround the fortress, set up their guns, pound the wall to rubble, and then storm through the breaches with overwhelming force. The defenders will be swept aside in hours, maybe days at most. That's what everyone expects. That's what military logic dictates. But here's the thing about history, Summitim. Yes, military logic doesn't account for human courage, tactical brilliance, and sheer stubborn determination. The Ottoman army arrives at Koszeg in August of 1522. Imagine being on those walls and watching this force arrive. First come the scouts and advance troops, securing the area. Then the cavalry, thousands upon thousands of horsemen, their banners and pennants turning the landscape into a sea of color. Then the infantry, marching in disciplined formations. And then the guns, the massive bronze cannons, each one pulled by teams of oxen, each one capable of hurling destruction against stone walls. The army spreads out around the fortress, setting up camps, establishing siege lines, positioning artillery. It must have looked like the end of the world to the defenders. Suleiman sends an envoy to the fortress. The message is simple: surrender now, and you'll be treated with honor. Your lives will be spared. You can leave with your possessions. Resist, and everyone dies. Every man, woman, and child in the fortress. No mercy, no quarter. It's a standard Ottoman tactic, and it usually works, because it's a reasonable offer when you're facing impossible odds. Jurisic listens to the terms. He consults with his officers and with the town's leaders, and then he sends back his answer. The fortress will not surrender. Now, this seems insane, right? What possible calculation could justify this decision? But Jurisic understands something crucial about the strategic situation. If Koszeg falls quickly, if the Ottomans can brush past it without delay, then the road to Vienna is open. Suleiman can continue his campaign, potentially capturing or threatening Vienna before the onset of winter. But if Koszeg can hold out, if it can delay the Ottoman advance by even a few weeks, then winter will come, and the Ottoman army will have to withdraw. Campaigns in this era are seasonal. Armies can't stay in the field during the harsh Central European winter, especially not an army as large as Suleiman's, which requires enormous amounts of food and supplies. If Jurisic can buy time, he might save not just his own fortress, but the entire region. It's a gamble, but it's the only play he has. The siege begins. Ottoman engineers start constructing siege works, digging trenches, building platforms for their artillery. And then the bombardment starts. The earth shakes as dozens of cannons open fire simultaneously. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds smash into the fortress walls. The noise is constant, day and night, a thunderous roar that makes normal conversation impossible, that rattles teeth and turns sleep into a distant memory. The walls start to crack, chunks of stone exploding outward with each impact. Breaches begin to open, but the defenders don't just sit there and take it. Jurisic is an experienced commander, and he knows siege warfare. Every night, under cover of darkness, his men work frantically to repair the damage. They shore up the wall, LS with timber and earth. They build internal barriers behind the breaches so that even if the Ottomans break through the outer wall, they'll face another obstacle. It's exhausting, back-breaking work, and it has to be done while Ottoman sharpshooters fire at anyone who shows themselves on the walls. The Ottomans launch their first assault. Thousands of troops surge forward toward the breaches in the walls. The defenders meet them with everything they have: muskets, crossbows, improvised weapons, rocks, boiling water, anything that can kill or injure the attackers. The fighting is brutal, hand to hand in the narrow breaches. The Ottomans have numbers, but the defenders have desperation and the advantage of fighting from prepared position. The first assault is thrown back, then comes the second assault, then the third. Each time, the Ottomans attack with fresh troops. Each time, the exhausted defenders somehow find the strength to push them back. Days turn into weeks. The bombardment continues, more assaults come. The walls are increasingly shattered, but the defenders refuse to break. Jurisic is everywhere, rallying his men, directing the defense, leading counterattacks. He's wounded multiple times but keeps fighting. His presence becomes legendary among the defenders. As long as Jurisic is on the walls, they believe they can hold. But the situation is becoming desperate. Ammunition is running low. Food supplies are dwindling. The defenders are exhausted, wounded, dying. The fortress is being reduced to rubble around them. Ottoman sappers are digging mines under the walls, planting explosives to bring down entire sections. The defenders try to countermine, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman efforts fighting. Brutal underground battles in the darkness. And then something extraordinary happened. After 25 days of continuous siege, after dozens of assaults, after expending enormous quantity of ammunition and losing thousands of men, Suleiman makes a decision that shocks everyone. He offers terms again. Not the harsh ultimatum of the beginning, but actual, honorable terms. Jurisic and his men can leave the fortress with their weapons, their flags flying, with full military honors. No reprisals, no captives. Free passage to safety. Why? Why would the most powerful sultan in the world, commanding 80,000 troops, offer honorable terms to a garrison of 2,000 that he could eventually overwhelm by sheer weight of numbers? Several factors are at play. First, time. It's now late August, heading into September. The campaigning season is running out. Every day spent at Koszeg is a day not spent marching on Vienna. Suleiman realizes that this little fortress has already achieved what Jurisic set out to do. It had delayed the Ottoman advance long enough that a march on Vienna is no longer feasible this year. Second, casualties. The repeated assaults have cost the Ottomans dearly. Thousands of soldiers have been killed or wounded trying to take this fortress. The elite Janissaries have been bloodied. For what? A small castle that's barely even a strategic prize anymore. Third, and perhaps most importantly, morale and prestige. The siege has become an embarrassment. Word is spreading throughout Europe that the mighty Ottoman army, fresh from its victories, has been held up by a tiny garrison in an obscure fortress. The longer the siege continues, the worse it looks. But there's another element too, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Suleiman is impressed. By all accounts, the Sultan develops a genuine respect for Jurisic and his defenders. They've shown the kind of courage and skill that any warrior culture admires. Suleiman is a military man himself, and he recognizes what he's seeing: a masterclass in defensive warfare against impossible odds. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, that Suleiman personally meets with Jurisic during the negotiation. The Sultan allegedly tells him, "You have defended your fortress with such honor that I would rather have you as a friend than an enemy." Jurisic faces a terrible decision. His men are at the end of their strength. The fortress is barely standing. They've held out for nearly a month, which is far longer than anyone thought possible, and they've achieved their strategic objective. The campaign season is over. Vienna is safe, but accepting surrender, even on honorable terms, means giving up the fortress. It means the Ottomans still win, in a sense. Jurisic negotiates. He asks for time to consult with his commanders and with the Austrian Archduke whose territory this is. Suleiman agrees to a temporary ceasefire while messengers are sent, and here's where the historical record gets a bit murky, because different sources tell this part of the story differently. Some say that Jurisic genuinely intended to surrender on the offered terms and was waiting for permission from his superiors. Others say it was a delaying tactic, that Jurisic was buying more time, gambling that Suleiman would get impatient and leave. What we know for certain is that after a few more days, the Ottomans do leave. They don't storm the fortress in a final, overwhelming assault. They pack up their siege guns, strike their camps, and march away. Some sources say that Jurisic formally agreed to symbolic terms where he would hand over the keys to the fortress. Suleiman would accept them and then immediately return them, allowing Jurisic to claim. He never surrendered, while Suleiman could claim he accepted the fortress's capitulation. It's the kind of face-saving diplomatic fiction that allows both sides to claim victory. Other sources say there was no formal agreement at all, that Suleiman simply decided the fortress wasn't worth any more time or lives and moved on. What we know for absolute certain is this: by early September 1522, the Ottoman army withdraws from Koszeg. The fortress remains in Christian hands. Jurisic and his men have survived, and the Ottoman campaign in Hungary for that year is effectively over. Suleiman's army retreats back to Ottoman territory as autumn sets in. The news spreads across Europe like wildfire. 2,000 men held off 80,000. A tiny fortress stopped the advance of the most powerful military force in the world. It seems impossible, miraculous even. The Catholic Church certainly portrays it that way, calling it divine intervention. Jurisic becomes a hero throughout Christian Europe. He's celebrated in songs and stories. The Habsburg Emperor personally honors him. The Siege of Koszeg enters the mythology of European resistance against Ottoman expansion. But what really happened here? How do we explain this outcome? Because while courage and skill matter, they don't usually overcome a 40-to-1 numerical disadvantage. Let's break down the factors that made this unlikely defense possible. First, fortification. Even though Koszeg wasn't a major fortress, it was still a proper medieval castle with thick stone walls. Siege warfare in this period heavily favored the defender. A well-built fortification could withstand enormous punishment, and as long as the defenders had the will to fight and the resources to repair damage, it could hold out for a surprisingly long time. Jurisic maximized this advantage by constantly repairing and reinforcing the walls. Second, leadership. Jurisic was an exceptional commander. He kept team morale high despite impossible circumstances. He made smart tactical decisions about where to concentrate his limited forces. He inspired his men by example, fighting alongside them and sharing their dangers. Leadership in siege warfare is absolutely critical, and Jurisic provided it. Third, the nature of siege assaults. When the Ottomans attacked the breaches in the walls, they couldn't use their numerical superiority effectively. A breach is a narrow opening, and only so many troops can fight there at once. The defenders could concentrate their forces at these choke points. In many ways, the siege became a series of small-scale battles where numbers mattered, less than position and determination. Fourth, Ottoman strategic considerations. This is crucial. Suleiman wasn't actually trying to conquer Koszeg for its own sake. He was trying to move past it quickly. Once it became clear that quick victory was impossible, the strategic calculus changed. Continuing the siege was costing him time and troops he needed for his real objectives. From a purely strategic standpoint, bypassing or withdrawing from Koszeg made sense once it had delayed him sufficiently. Fifth, and this is often overlooked, the defenders probably weren't quite as outnumbered as the dramatic numbers suggest. Yes, the Ottoman army numbered in the tens of thousands, but not all of those troops were front-line combat soldiers involved in the actual assaults. A large portion of that 80,000 were support troops, engineers, camp followers, servants, and logistics personnel. The actual combat ratio was probably more like 10 or 15 to 1, which is still overwhelming but not quite as impossibly lopsided. Sixth, casualties and morale. Siege assaults are incredibly costly for the attackers. You're sending men into a kill zone where the defenders have every advantage. The Ottomans were losing hundreds, possibly thousands of men in these repeated assaults. At some point, even for a large army, those losses become significant. The elite Janissaries especially weren't unlimited in number, and losing them taking a strategically marginal fortress wasn't a good trade. But even accounting for all these factors, what happened at Koszeg remains extraordinary. The defenders held out for 25 to 30 days, depending on which source you trust, against an enemy that by all conventional military wisdom should have crushed them in a matter of hours or days. They achieved their strategic objective of delaying the Ottoman advance, and they survived to tell about it, which in itself is remarkable. The long-term consequences of this siege rippled outward through history. Suleiman's failure to advance on Vienna in 1522 gave the Habsburgs time to prepare and strengthen their defenses. When the Ottomans finally did besiege Vienna in 1529, the city was ready, and that siege also ended in Ottoman withdrawal, the high water mark of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe had been reached. While the Ottomans would remain a major threat for decades and even centuries to come, they would never achieve the complete conquest of Hungary or advance significantly beyond it. For Hungary itself, the respite was brief. In 1526, just 4 years after the Siege of Koszeg, the Ottomans returned. At the Battle of Mohacs, the Hungarian army was utterly destroyed. King Louis II, that young, inexperienced king I mentioned earlier, was killed trying to flee the battlefield. Hungary as an independent kingdom effectively ceased to exist, divided between Ottoman occupation, Habsburg control, and a semi-independent principality in Transylvania. The kingdom wouldn't be reunified and free from foreign domination until the late 17th and early 18th centuries. But Koszeg stands as a symbol. It represents what determination and skilled leadership can accomplish against overwhelming odds. It shows that David really can defeat Goliath, or at least hold him off long enough to matter. And it reminds us that history isn't just written by massive armies and powerful empires. Sometimes it's written by small groups of people who refuse to give up, who hold the line when holding seems impossible, who buy with their courage and blood the time that others need. Nikola Jurisic lived for another 20 years after the siege. He continued to serve as a military commander and administrator in the borderlands between Habsburg and Ottoman territory. He never achieved great wealth or fame beyond his role at Koszeg, but he had done something that money and titles can't buy. He had earned a place in history. When he died in 1543, he was remembered as the man who held the fortress, the commander who looked at 80,000 enemies and said no, the defender who gave an empire pause. Today, Koszeg is a small town in western Hungary near the Austrian border. The fortress still stands, though much of it has been rebuilt and renovated over the centuries. There's a museum dedicated to the siege. Every year, the town holds festivals and reenactments commemorate those desperate days in August and September of 1522. Tourists visit, take photos, walk the walls where Jurisic and his men fought. It's hard, looking at the peaceful town today, to imagine it as the site of such desperate violence, such impossible courage, but that's the nature of history. The great events, the moments when the fate of nations hung in the balance, they happen in ordinary places. Koszeg wasn't special before the siege. It was just another fortress in a landscape full of fortifications. What made it special was what happened there, and more specifically, the people who chose to make a stand there. There's a tendency in modern times to view historical military conflicts through a lens of inevitability. We know how things turned out, so we assume they had to turn out that way. The Ottoman Empire was powerful, therefore it must have been destined to fail in its expansion into Europe. The Habsburgs were a major dynasty, therefore they must have been fated to resist successfully. But people living through these events didn't know what was inevitable. They didn't know how things would turn out. Jurisic didn't know if he could hold for a day, let alone a month. His soldiers didn't know if their next assault would be their last. Suleiman didn't know if his next wave of troops would finally break through. History is made by people making decisions with incomplete information, taking enormous risks, gambling their lives on uncertain outcomes. And that's what makes the story of Koszeg so compelling. It wasn't inevitable. It could easily have gone differently. If Jurisic had been a less capable commander, the fortress probably falls. If the defenders had broken under the pressure, the fortress falls. If Suleiman had been willing to spend another week or two regardless of the counter, the fortress probably falls. The outcome rested on a knife's edge, on 1,000 small decisions and random chances, but it didn't fall. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, the defenders held. They held because they chose to hold. They held because they believed it mattered. And Hey were right. It did matter. That one small fortress, those 2,000 defenders, they changed the course of a campaign, delayed an empire and bought time for a civilization to prepare its defense. So what can we take away from this story 500 years later? Maybe it's that numbers aren't everything. That courage and intelligence can multiply force. That leadership matters enormously in moments of crisis. That people can accomplish things that seem impossible when the stakes are high enough and the cause is just enough. That sometimes holding the line for one more day, surviving one more assault, enduring one more bombardment, that's enough. You don't always have to win a total victory. Sometimes you just have to not lose until circumstances change in your favor. The Siege of Koszeg wasn't the largest battle in history. It wasn't even the most important siege in the long conflict between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire, but it was one of the most improbable. It was a moment when everything said the defenders should lose and they didn't. It was a moment when conventional military wisdom said resistance was futile and resistance succeeded anyway. It was a small story in the grand sweep of history. But sometimes the small stories are the ones that remind us what humans are capable of when we're pushed to our limits and refuse to break. 2,000 defenders, 80,000 attackers, 25 days, one fortress. And at the end of it all, the fortress still stood, and the empire moved on, its momentum broken, its timetable disrupted, its aura of invincibility ever so slightly tarnished. That's the power of determined resistance. That's the legacy of Koszeg. That's the story of how a handful of people, in an ordinary place, at an extraordinary moment, changed history by simply refusing to give up.